The chill of the morning fog spreads over the field, where two worlds recently stood, the northern and the southern, one in chains of metal, the other in wool, leather, and blood. How did it happen that savages with axes broke the steel ranks of knights, whose armor cost as much as an entire village? Why did those who were called barbarians again and again emerge victorious against those who considered themselves the pinnacle of Europe's military art? The answer is hidden not in brute force, but in the very understanding of war. And this answer, perhaps, will change how you see bravery. Archaeological findings on the banks of the Thames and at the mouths of the Seine confirm, from the end of the 9th century, Viking raids became systemic. These were not just robberies. This was a strategy designed to exhaust the enemy. According to the chronicles of monks from the Abbey of Saint-Denis, it is known that over 20 years the Northerners burned more than 100 settlements without engaging in major battles. Their strength was not in battles, but in the ability to force the enemy to fight on their terms. These warriors called themselves huscarls, the personal guard of the konung. A huscarl is not just a warrior. He is a man sworn to loyalty unto death. In his life, there was no concept of retreat, only a step forward as long as breath allowed. Their bodies were trained not in castles, but in the storms of the North Sea, where every wave could become a grave. Imagine the sound of their advance, not the roar of a trumpet, but the scraping of wood as the longship's prow plunged into the shore, and shouts that drowned out the wind. At this time, a knight was still trying on his helmet before a mirror, while the northerner was already stepping onto the wet pebbles, gripping an axe whose handle had been polished by sweat and blood. The weight of a knight's plate armor reached 30 kilograms, almost as much as an entire Viking kit, including weapons and shield, weighed. The difference in mobility decided everything. A knight could be a wall, but a Viking was a storm. His armor, an ash shield, his speed, like a gust of wind in a storm. According to the English chronicler Asser, Vikings were able to move faster than any army in Europe of their time. They crossed tens of kilometers across rivers and swamps in a day, changing direction like a pack of wolves. And this was a time when heavy cavalry was just beginning to define the face of war. And against these light, maneuverable northerners, it was helpless, like a cumbersome beast surrounded by a pack of hunters. Their main weapon was not a sword and not an axe, but surprise. They appeared where no one expected, in a harbor, in a monastery, on a cliff above the sea. Modern science calls this tactic raid warfare, a series of swift strikes with minimal losses. For a knight, this was unthinkable, for honor demanded a face-to-face stand. For a Viking, honor was to survive and return with plunder. But why were these northern barbarians able to so easily shatter the foundations of Europe, defended by steel-clad knights? What was it about them that allowed them to challenge an entire continent? Because their strength was born not in the forge, but in the heart. And soon, at the dawn of a new millennium, this pulse of the northern seas would crash upon Europe with a fury that neither steel nor faith could stop. When morning over the North Sea is shrouded in gray light, and the air carries the scent of salt and smoke, on the shores of Scandinavia began what chroniclers called the time of the sword. Every son of the fjord had to be ready to fight, for honor, for plunder, for a name that the sagas would remember. But a Viking's strength was born long before he lifted a sword. It forged itself in cold, hunger, and endless training, transforming a person into an instrument of battle. Historians write that the training of a northern warrior began in childhood. Boys were taught to throw spears, row, mend sails, and survive in the mountains. While a European knight was learning to hold the reins, a Scandinavian was already steering a ship in a storm. This upbringing laid the foundation for what would later determine the outcome of many battles: physical endurance and psychological resilience. Archaeological finds in Birka and Trosa show that Viking armor was light and their weapons were functional. The weight of chainmail rarely exceeded 10 kilograms, and helmets were made without visors to avoid restricting vision. Their main principle was not to be protected, but to be the first to strike, and in this lay the essence of the northern approach to war. Such a style of combat required not discipline, as in knightly orders, but synchronicity. When dozens of warriors attacked shoulder to shoulder, they moved as a single entity. This formation was called the shield wall. Ash shields closed into a single living organism that could withstand the charge of cavalry and yet remain mobile. The shield wall was not just a line of defense, it was the breath of dozens of people, merging into the rhythm of battle. When one shield broke, a neighbor covered the gap. When a warrior fell, his place was taken by the next. This principle was like the heart of a longship, where each plank kept the entire hull afloat. A knight fought alone for glory. A Viking fought together for victory. In Scandinavian sagas, there is a term drakar, a longship with a carved dragon on its prow. For a modern person, this is just a symbol, but for the Northerners, it was a living creature. They said, "Our drakar breathes when we row." The ship was an extension of the body, a battle home that could deliver warriors to the very heart of the enemy. Modern research shows that a drakar could cover up to 100 kilometers a day across rivers and seas. Thanks to its shallow draft, the vessel could easily land on shore, even in swamps or sand. This transformed the Vikings into ghosts, appearing out of nowhere. Their arrival was impossible to predict. Historians differ on where exactly the first major clashes between Vikings and knights took place. But one thing is clear. The Northerners knew in advance whom they would have to fight. They studied the enemy, his habits, his routes, his weaknesses. This was a reconnaissance approach, rare for that time. Warriors raised among the ice understood. Survival belongs not to the strongest, but to the most observant. Chivalry was built on the idea of predictability, duels, a code of conduct, single combat. The Viking shattered this. He did not follow rules. He could attack at night, in a storm, during prayer. His goal was not honor, but results. And that is why he often won in clashes with feudal armies. But behind this fury lay another force, faith. Not religion in the usual sense, but the conviction that death was not the end. A Viking did not fear death because he knew to die with a sword in hand meant entering Valhalla, Odin's halls. This was not a poetic image, but a real part of their fighting spirit. Archaeologists found inscriptions on gravestones. He fell with a weapon. He lives. For a knight, defeat was a disgrace. For a Viking, it was a chance at immortality. Here, the main contrast of the eras is born. A knight fought to preserve life and land, while a Viking to prove he was worthy of it. This gave his step the power that made steel-clad enemies tremble. For how can one defeat someone who is not afraid to die? And when the first cries of war horns echoed over the Loire and the Thames, Europe understood. Not barbarians had come to them, but a new military mindset. Light, mobile, unpredictable. It brought a storm against which no knightly code could raise a shield. And this storm was already approaching. The flame of torches reflects in the water as the first longships cut through the darkness. On their prows, dragon heads, whose eyes seem to look through the night. Thus began one of the most audacious operations of the early Middle Ages, the Viking campaign into Frankish lands. The year, around 859. According to Nithard's chronicles, the Northerners approached the mouth of the Seine suddenly, without declaration of war, without insignia, only the clatter of oars and the cries of seagulls. Frankish knights did not yet know whom they were dealing with. They believed in order, in trumpet signals, in formations, in discipline. But against the Vikings, these rules meant nothing. 100 ships entered the river and, in a matter of days, captured the coastal fortresses. Not a single garrison had time to prepare. The enemy came not by road, but by water. Contemporaries called this tactic "strike from the sea." Today, historians explain, this was the first form of amphibious warfare. The key term is blitz raid. It signifies a swift strike at weak points before the enemy can gather its forces. The Vikings did not seek to hold territory. They acted like a storm. Strike, disappear. The image of this war is simple, as if the very elements emerged from the sea and swept away everything in their path. When the knights gathered for council, the Northerners were already leaving with their plunder. Archaeologists found dozens of spearheads, shield fragments, and remains of ship nails in the Rouen area. Traces of sudden clashes where each encounter lasted minutes. Knights in plate armor, whose movements were constrained by kilograms of steel, found themselves helpless in the mud and near the water. The weight of their armor reached 35 kilograms, to which a sword, shield, helmet, and stirrups were added. A Viking, however, could run knee-deep in mud, jump into the water, strike, and immediately retreat. Flexibility was in his arsenal. For the knight, it was pride. The chronicler Fulda wrote that Frankish commanders did not understand how the enemy fought without order, but this chaos was carefully planned. Before landing, the Vikings formed a shield wall covering each other. Their front line absorbed the impact, while the rear delivered counterattacks, short, sharp, like gusts of wind. Among their weapons, the seax, a short, single-edged sword, held a special place. The seax did not gleam like a knight's blade, but it was ideal for close combat. It could be used for thrusting and slashing from any angle. According to finds in Hedeby, the length of a seax rarely exceeded 70 centimeters, but it was wielded with such speed that knights often did not even understand where the blow came from. Battles with Vikings were unlike traditional battles. It was not a frontal assault, it was a hunt. The Northerners surrounded the enemy, struck from the flanks, and set ambushes at crossings. Every stone, every river became part of their weapon. In the Chronicles of England from that time, the phrase, "they came from the fog," often appears. This was not a poetic image, but a literal description. Vikings used morning mist and rain to conceal their movement. But behind this mobility lay a strict structure. At the center of the battle formation was always the konung, or jarl, surrounded by huskarls, his personal guard. They not only protected their leader, but served as the backbone of the entire army. If the huskarls stood firm, the army would not waver. If they fell, the battle was considered lost. Their steadfastness became legendary. It was written that one huskarl could hold a position against 3 knights because he did not fear pain. He was trained to fight in close formation, using not only his sword, but everything at hand. A broken shield, a stone, a knife. His muscles were like ship's ropes, stretched to their limit. And when a cavalry charge bore down on him, he simply dropped to one knee, letting the blow pass, then struck the horse's flank. Many chroniclers accused the Vikings of treachery, but it was precisely this treachery that marked the beginning of a new understanding of war: flexibility, speed, initiative. They did not recognize sacred rules of combat, but they understood the value of every second. For them, it was not the ritual that mattered, but the outcome. And Europe, for the first time, encountered an enemy who could not be defeated by fear, because the Viking himself was the embodiment of fear, not personal, but ancient, like the cold of the sea. And this fear, once unleashed on land, could no longer be driven back into the waves. Over the plains of England stretches a fog, thick and heavy, like the breath of the earth before a storm. Hundreds of knights form battle ranks, shields, spears, horses, banners. The clang of metal fills the air. Every steel plate is adjusted. Every strap is tightened to its limit. Across the river, the Vikings are silent. They stand in wool tunics, with leather belts, with round shields, with axes that seemed to have absorbed the blood of dozens of battles. 2 worlds gaze at each other. One, a symbol of power and order, the other, an embodiment of freedom and chaos. This scene is described in the Chronicles of the Battle of Malden in 991. Anglo-Saxon knights clad in chainmail lined up on the shore to prevent the northerners from crossing. They were commanded by Byrhtnoth, Earl of Essex. He believed in the honor of combat and allowed the enemy to cross the river to fight by the rules. A chronicler, writing about it later, noted, "Thus honor became his downfall." When the Vikings stepped ashore, they did not wait for a signal. They struck first. Here, for the first time, Europe encountered what would later be called aggressive mobility, the ability to attack instantly without losing formation. This Viking tactic was called svinfylking, the swine. This is how they referred to the wedge formation that cut into the enemy's ranks, breaking its center. This was not just a maneuver. It was the embodiment of their spirit, a direct strike without hesitation. Imagine this moment, the roar of horns, the shriek of metal, the clash of shields. Vikings run down the slope, shouting one word, "Odin!" Knights dismount, try to hold the line, but the northern wedge crashes into them with the force of a sea wave. The first rank falls. The second does not have time to regroup. Every axe blow splits wood and flesh. Chronicles state that Vikings made no distinction between noblemen and commoners. Their goal was not to capture, but to destroy. This was not cruelty, but strategy, to deprive the enemy of leadership, to cause chaos. Archaeologists found remains with bisected skulls under Maldon, struck from top to bottom, a typical trace of the battle axe, the broadaxe. This weapon weighed about 2 kilograms and could penetrate even chainmail. The broadaxe was not just an axe, but a symbol of northern equality. Both jarl and peasant wielded it. With a single motion, it shattered armor like wood. This weapon did not require knightly skill, only resolve, and the Vikings' resolve was absolute. But not only weapons decided the outcome. The Northerners knew how to use terrain. When knights advanced, Vikings retreated into the swamps, luring the heavy cavalry. Horses got stuck, spears broke, formations collapsed. Then the Northerners turned around and struck the flanks. It was a living chess game where every move was calculated, only instead of pieces, people. Modern researchers believe that the Vikings' success was due to their organization. Despite their apparent savagery, they acted on horn signals. Each sound meant a maneuver, advance, flanking, retreat. This was a primitive yet precise system of commands, understandable even in the din of battle. When the Battle of Maldon ended, the field was strewn with bodies. More than half of the knights had fallen. The chronicler wrote, "They fought bravely, but one cannot stand against the wind." This metaphor became the key to understanding the clash of two worlds. Knights believed in armor, Vikings in speed. Their spirit was fueled by faith in posthumous glory. Before battle, Vikings cast lots to see who was destined for Valhalla. This ritual reminded them that the outcome was already decided, and fear lost its meaning. Psychologically, they were free, and a free warrior is more dangerous than any clad in armor. The dead remained on the field, but victory belonged to the living. The names of the fallen knights vanished from the chronicles, but the fame of the Northerners spread across the continent. Their songs were sung even where they were feared, because it was not just a victory in battle. It was the end of an era when armor was considered invincible. And yet, in this storm, the first echo of the future was already sounding, a clash in which the strength of steel would finally meet the wisdom of the sea. For knights would begin to learn from their enemies, but first, Europe would endure decades of fire, plunder, and fear, when the name Viking would signify not a people, but a phenomenon. The ashes of bonfires slowly settle on the ground. The wind carries the scent of burning and salty water. On the shores of Europe there is no longer silence, only traces of burned monasteries, ruined forts, and hundreds of crosses stuck in the ground. From the mid-10th century, Vikings were no longer mere raiders. They transformed into rulers. Those who came from the sea like a storm now remained on land like a tempest that became the wind of history. Archaeological data from York and Rouen confirm the Northerners' settlements turned into cities. They built fortifications, minted coins, adopted Christianity, but the spirit of their warfare never disappeared. This spirit became the foundation of Europe's new military culture. The irony of fate, those very people who were considered destroyers taught Europe to wage war in a new way. The key term of this period is družina. A modern person might hear something simple, almost mundane in this word, but in those times it was a special form of military organization. A družina was an alliance of a leader and his warriors, bound not by command but by oath. It was a prototype of feudal loyalty, but without the knightly pathos. Everyone knew his place beside the konung was not bought, but earned with blood. The Scandinavian družina was mobile. While European armies spent weeks gathering militias, a družina could set out on campaign the very next day. This changed the very concept of war. The Vikings were the first to transform detachments into professional military forces. Subsequently, it was based on their model that Europe's first standing armies were built. In the 11th century, the descendants of the Vikings, the Normans, stormed England. On the field at Hastings in 1066, two worlds clashed, born of a single northern element. On one side, knights under the banner of William the Conqueror, a descendant of the Viking Rollo. On the other, Anglo-Saxons, also heirs of Scandinavian blood. And although a century had passed since the first raids began, in this battle, it was again not steel but speed, not the gleam of armor but the ability to maneuver that decided the outcome. Historians write that William used a feigned retreat, a tactic first employed by the Vikings. This was a cunning maneuver, to feign retreat, lure the enemy out, and then strike when they lost formation. Thus, the victory at Hastings became the last echo of the ancient northern school. Europe learned a lesson that began on the icy fjords and ended on a foggy English hill. It was then that chivalry changed. Warriors in armor began to understand. An armored fist was nothing without wit and speed. Light units, reconnaissance, a system of signals began to appear. Everything that the Vikings had practiced for centuries. Even shipbuilding changed, from heavy barges to long, narrow vessels capable of sailing against the wind. Archaeologists in Normandy found an inscription on a stone. "We came from the sea to stay." These words precisely express the essence of the era. The Vikings ceased to be a storm, but the storm changed the air. New dynasties emerged from their culture: Danish, Norwegian, Norman kings, who became the legitimate heirs of those whom Europe once called pirates. But along with this came the end of the old way. When northern warriors began to own castles, their swords dulled from idleness. They no longer lived in boats and did not warm themselves by fires on the shores. Their descendants wore coats of arms and participated in tournaments, forgetting the smell of salt on their skin after battle. History seemed to come full circle. Barbarians turned into knights, and knights into heirs of barbarians. However, the Viking did not disappear. He remained in legends, in the blood of those who still seek risk and challenge, because the true victory of the Northerners was not in conquered lands, but in the fact that they forever changed the very meaning of courage. They proved strength is not armor, but the will to move forward when the whole world is against you. And even when Europe drowned in luxury and dogmas, the memory of the people who came from the sea continued to live in songs. For every storm begins with a single stroke of an oar, and every people once decides what is more terrifying, to perish or to remain. And ahead, silence, in which a new question is born. If you had stood on the shore then, amidst the roar of horns and the shriek of metal, whose side would you have been on? In shining armor, or among those who go against the wind? When the last Viking ships disappeared beyond the horizon, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But the sound of their oars did not dissolve in the waves. It remained in the very fabric of history. The Northerners disappeared, but their spirit was absorbed by those who came after. For the Vikings' victory lay not in burned cities, but in the fact that they changed the very philosophy of war. Chivalry, seeing an enemy that neither steel nor fear could stop, was forced to change. Воины начали тренироваться не только в искусстве удара, но и в умении мыслить. Появились разведчики, легкие маневренные отряды, сигнальные рога и короткие мечи. Все то, чему Европа научилась у северян. Даже латные доспехи стали тоньше, а походы быстрее.
Современные археологи нашли в Швеции меч с рунами, на которых выбита «скорость важнее стали». Эта надпись будто обращена к нам через тысячелетия. Викинги понимали, победа рождается не из блеска оружия, а из решимости сделать первый шаг, когда остальные колеблются. И, может быть, в этом их главный урок для нас. Каждый век рождает свои битвы, не всегда с мечом, но всегда со страхом. Северяне учат не бояться бурь, потому что буря — это жизнь. Их история напоминает, броня защищает тело, но не дух. И тот, кто надеется лишь на железо, уже проиграл тому, кто верит в себя. Археологи до сих пор находят следы тех, кто шел по ветру. Кости, клинки, обугленные ладьи. Но настоящие следы викингов не в земле, а в людях. В каждом, кто не сдается, кто идет вперед, даже когда все вокруг рушится. Так почему же северные воины побеждали рыцарей? Потому что они не сражались ради славы, они сражались, чтобы жить. Их оружием была решимость, их доспехом — вера, их богом — путь. И теперь, зная это, стоит задать себе вопрос. Если бы буря пришла сегодня, хватило бы у тебя духа идти против ветра, как когда-то шли они?